The Yamaha MONTAGE M, as with the previous Montage generation, is billed as a music synthesizer rather than a workstation, and it's designed to be used with a DAW for recording purposes. This video aims to provide an in-depth, step-by-step guide to getting the most out of your MONTAGE M when your DAW of choice is Logic Pro. Many of the principles I described in my previous integration with Logic video series are still relevant, as MONTAGE M shares a lot of its functionality with the previous generation MONTAGE and MODX. But there are some important differences, particularly with regard to MIDI handling, so it seemed a good time to produce a whole new video dedicated to MONTAGE M and Logic Pro 11. If you already know the basics and want to jump ahead, I've added clickable timestamps in the description, and I'll add a handful of useful jump points on screen now. Before we get started, you need to get your system connected and configured correctly, or none of the stuff I'm going to describe will work for you. So first things first, you must have the Yamaha Steinberg USB driver correctly installed and working. I have a separate video showing how to do this, which I'll link in the description and up there in the top right corner. Next, your MONTAGE M must be connected to your computer with a USB cable into the USB to host port on the back of the synth, and the MONTAGE M must be set to use USB as its MIDI in-out setting. To do this, go to Utility, Settings, MIDI I/O, find the MIDI in-out setting and ensure that you're set to USB and not MIDI, which uses the DIN-MIDI port rather than USB connection. Do bear in mind that at the time of recording, the display color scheme for MONTAGE M is rather horrible, and it's far more difficult than it should be to identify which option is actually selected. While you're in that settings page on the MONTAGE M, ensure that MIDI sync is set to MIDI so that it will respond to tempo changes and sync with your DAW. Once this is done, you can verify that it's working by opening Applications, Utilities, Audio MIDI Setup on your Mac, and you should see a MONTAGE M device in MIDI Studio, and in Audio Devices you'll see a MONTAGE M device with 6 outputs and 32 inputs. If you see a MONTAGE M device but it has 8 inputs rather than 32, it means you've set the MONTAGE M to 192 kHz USB audio output. Go to Utility, Settings, Audio I/O on the MONTAGE M and change Audio I/O mode to 16 stereo 44.1 kHz, then reboot the synth for the settings to take effect. Just an FYI here, but if you change that Audio I/O mode with the intention of getting the highest quality from the analog audio output, then you've been barking up the wrong tree, as this setting only controls USB audio and has no effect on the analog outputs, which will always run at the highest possible quality. If you don't see a MONTAGE M audio device and a MONTAGE M MIDI device, you either don't have the driver installed correctly or your synth isn't correctly connected to the computer. Go back to the beginning of this section and check that everything is as I described it. With everything configured correctly, it's time to start a new project in Logic. Let's bring up the New Project wizard and select the Empty Project option. In the Details section, set the input and output devices to MONTAGE M. For most of this video, I'm going to use MONTAGE M as the audio interface, but I'm aware that many of you will have other audio interfaces in use, so I'll add a section later in this video to talk through how to approach that. For now though, ensure that your sample rate is set to 44.1 kHz, and we're ready to go. We need to do a little more settings configuration, but Logic won't open without at least one track, so just pick External MIDI with Use External Instrument plugin disabled, and I'll explain why shortly, and then choose MONTAGE M port 1 with channel 1 as the MIDI destination. Now that we're in the main Logic interface, we need to make a few settings changes. Bear in mind that these settings are saved with the project, so you'll need to do this every time you create a new project, unless you create a project template that includes these settings. I'll show you how to do that later in the video. We need to go into File, Project Settings, MIDI. We'll need to check the SysX with MIDI through function option, and I'll select MONTAGE M port 1 as the instrument without MIDI through function. I'll explain why in a moment. Next, switch to the synchronization section, and in the MIDI tab, you'll see a list of destinations which will all show off at the moment. Click on the first destination and pick MONTAGE M port 1 as the destination. Next, check the clock option to send MIDI clock from Logic to the MONTAGE M. You can leave the PDC, MTC and MMC checkboxes alone for now. Close the project settings window and we can now check that everything is working correctly. Hit the play button in Logic and you should see your MONTAGE M immediately switch its tempo to the BPM set in Logic. If you adjust the tempo in Logic while it's playing, the MONTAGE M should respond immediately, and any arpeggios playing on MONTAGE M will stay perfectly in sync with tempo changes in Logic. Let's talk for a moment about local control. When you use the MONTAGE M without a DAW, the keyboard and controls are connected directly to the tone generator inside the synth, and this is called local control. When you're using a DAW, you actually need to sever that direct connection so that the DAW has full control over the tone generator. If you don't disable local control, you can get all sorts of weirdness like doubling or even tripling of recorded MIDI notes where the system gets into a sort of feedback loop. I won't go into detail here except to say that working with local control enabled can cause all sorts of undesirable problems, so just don't do it. Disable local control by going to Utility, Settings, MIDI I/O, find the local control option and disable it. However, local control also applies to things like the knobs and faders on the MONTAGE M, and that's why we use that sysx with MIDI through function setting, which allows the system exclusive, or sysx, MIDI signals generated by the control panel on the MONTAGE M to be redirected back to the synth. Without the sysx with MIDI through function, some of the controls will fail to operate at all with local control disabled. Which brings us back to why we disabled the external instrument plugin option when creating a MIDI track. For reasons known only to Apple, the external instrument plugin filters out all sysx data, which means that big chunks of the Montage control panel would not receive the necessary control data and become useless, so when working with MONTAGE M, MONTAGE and MODX, we can't use the external instrument plugin. As a complex multi-timbral instrument, MONTAGE M has a more complex MIDI implementation than many other synthesizers, but once you know how it works, it's actually quite easy to manage. If you're a user of the classic Montage or MODX, you'll probably be familiar with the hybrid MIDI mode that was introduced with Montage OS 3. The MIDI implementation in MONTAGE M builds on the classic hybrid mode and adds a little more flexibility. On Performance Home, cycle the display mode control until you see MIDI I/O channel under the performance name. All performance parts with keyboard control enabled will send and receive on the MIDI channel set here, which defaults to channel 1. The only exception to this rule is parts which are set as external, but we'll cover that later. If your MONTAGE M is not currently set to use channel 1, change it now so that the MIDI I/O channel corresponds to the track we just created. You can also find this setting under Utility, Settings, MIDI I/O. We can test that Logic is properly receiving MIDI on the correct channel by playing a few chords on the MONTAGE M, and you'll see the signatures of the chords you're playing in the display at the top of the Logic interface. Let's record some MIDI from the MONTAGE M using parts with keyboard control enabled. Load the Composer Felt Piano performance, which has two parts that both have keyboard control enabled. Move the super knob to the central position so that the second part plays. In Logic, move the playhead to the start of the project and hit record. After the count-in, record a few notes and then stop the recording. Move the playhead to the beginning, hit play, and you'll hear your recorded notes just as you played them. So far, so simple, but what about parts that do not have keyboard control enabled? Let's add some more parts to our MONTAGE M performance so that we can see how this works. I'm going to add the Seek Blue bass performance to part 3, and the ANX over pad performance after that, which will occupy 3 parts. I'm going to disable keyboard control for the bass and pad parts. Parts with keyboard control disabled will send and receive on different channels, and while on the classic Montage these channels were fixed to correspond to the part number, with MONTAGE M it's possible to choose the channels used by each part, including setting multiple parts to use the same channel. With the display mode set to edit MIDI assignments, you'll see the internal-external switch and channel display against each part. To change the MIDI channel used by any parts, select the part and adjust the TX-RX channel control under the display to edit the channel number. The interface here is slightly confusing, because parts with keyboard control enabled still show the channel on which they would play if keyboard control were disabled. But rest assured, if they have keyboard control enabled, they will use the global MIDI I/O channel instead. Just to avoid confusion here, let's change the second piano part to use channel 1, even though it actually won't make any practical difference because the part has keyboard control. Next, let's set the bass part to use MIDI channel 2, and all 3 pad parts to use channel 3. Back in Logic, I'm going to create a couple of new tracks. I'm going to select external MIDI again, disable the Use External Instrument plugin option and set the MIDI destination to MONTAGE M port 1 channel 2. Check the ascending option and set the number of tracks to create to 2. This will create tracks pointing at channel 2 and channel 3. Select the track pointing at channel 2, reset the playhead and record a few notes as before. And then do the same with the channel 3 track to play all the pad parts. Now that we have some MIDI recorded, we can turn our attention to recording audio from the MONTAGE M. As we saw in Audio MIDI Setup, MONTAGE M presents an audio interface with 32 inputs to the computer. These 32 inputs correspond to 16 stereo channels, 1 stereo pair for each part of the performance. Normally, MONTAGE M will output the entirety of its audio output mixed down into the first stereo pair, so let's experiment with that first. I'm going to create a new track in Logic to record the audio output from the MONTAGE M. Select the Audio, Mic or Line option, and then in the Audio Input selector, go past all the single channel options and pick Input 1-2, which is the first stereo pair from the MONTAGE M audio interface. The audio should go to the stereo output, and we'll leave Record Enable checked. Set the playhead to the start and hit record, and while the MONTAGE M plays back your MIDI tracks, Logic will record the audio output. Once the audio has faded out, stop recording. You can now disable the MIDI tracks, either by muting them or turning them off if you have on-off visible in your track headers, and play back the recorded audio on its own. A single stereo track may be all that you need for your project, but MONTAGE M can use that 32-channel audio interface to output separate stereo channels for each part of the performance. First, let's re-enable our MIDI tracks so the synth has something to play. Next, create some additional audio tracks to receive the multi-channel audio. Select the Audio, Mic or Line track option again. It's at this point that I'm going to have to explain the slightly bonkers naming scheme that MONTAGE uses for its USB audio outputs. The first stereo USB audio pair, Logic Inputs 1-2, is called Main LR, which makes perfect sense. But then the next pair, Logic Inputs 3-4, is called USB 1-2, despite the fact that they're actually the third and fourth USB audio channels. Therefore, in order to record the audio for part 2, we need to listen to inputs 3 and 4, which MONTAGE identifies as USB 1-2. Ensure that the ascending option is checked on the audio input side and create 5 new tracks for a total of 6, listening to the input pairs up to input 11-12, which MONTAGE identifies as USB 9-10. Let's record arm all of those audio tracks. Now we need to configure the performance for multi-channel audio output. You could edit the performance and manually set each part to use a separate USB output channel pair, which can be very powerful if you want to combine some parts into a single stereo output while separating others. But a simpler and much quicker method is to use the Quick Setup system to select Audio Rec on DAW, which will instantly reconfigure each part to output on its own USB stereo pair. By default, running the Audio Rec on DAW macro on MONTAGE M will arbitrarily enable keyboard control for every part, so after you've run it, you'll need to manually turn off keyboard control for the bass and pad parts again. You should also be aware that by default, running Audio Rec on DAW re-enables local control, so be sure to disable it again if you plan to record any more MIDI. Audio Rec on DAW is not a system level setting. It's actually a macro that changes settings both from the system and the performance, and those performance level settings will be lost next time you load the performance if you don't save it after running the macro. Likewise, all of the preset performances on MONTAGE M use a single USB stereo pair for output, so if you load a new performance, the audio for that performance will immediately revert to stereo output instead of multi-channel until you run the Audio Rec on DAW macro again. But you won't be able to hear it because direct monitoring is switched off at the system level by the macro. To hear the output, we could either go into Utility, Settings, Audio I/O and re-enable the direct monitor setting, or instead we can use software monitoring so that we can hear what's being recorded. Check that it's enabled by going to Logic Pro, Settings, Audio, General, Software Monitoring. With all 6 of the audio tracks record armed, hit record again. When the recording is completed, disable the MIDI tracks again, and then you can listen to all the audio tracks together or solo individual tracks. So far, we've recorded MIDI, stereo audio, and multi-track audio separately, but there will be times where you want to record both together, and in fact, that would often be my recommendation. You may be accustomed to just recording the audio output from your synthesizers as you play live and working from there, but I would strongly recommend recording the MIDI output of any MIDI-capable instrument in addition to the audio output, just in case you decide later on that you want to make any changes to your performance. So I'll do a very quick demo of that now, although if you've followed everything so far, this should be fairly self-explanatory. I'm going to load the Theme 1982 performance on the MONTAGE M, which uses 4 parts, all of which have keyboard control enabled. Because all the parts have keyboard control, all the MIDI data will come in on the global MIDI channel, so we'll only need a single MIDI track. Next, I'll run the Audio Rec on DAW quick setup to have each part output on a separate stereo audio channel, and I'll create 4 audio tracks to capture those. Now I can just record arm all 5 tracks, hit record and start playing, and we'll capture the MIDI data and the multi-track audio all at the same time. I'm going to dive back into recording MIDI for a moment now, just to talk about a change in MONTAGE M related to arpeggios. If you previously watched my video describing how to integrate the classic MONTAGE and MODX with Logic Pro, you will have seen me use the ARP MIDI out switch to tell the MONTAGE to output not just the control notes, but the notes generated by the arpeggiator for the Stranger Dreams performance. The ARP MIDI out switch has been removed from MONTAGE M, and I thought for a while that it was no longer possible to transmit the output from the arpeggiator over MIDI, which would have been a huge loss of functionality. Thankfully, that's not actually the case, but it no longer works in the same way as before. With MONTAGE M, the ability to transmit the output of the arpeggiator as MIDI has been moved to the external part switch. Any parts marked as external will automatically transmit the notes generated by the arpeggiator, whereas internal parts will only transmit the notes actually played on the keyboard. So if we load up Stranger Dreams once again, if we want to record the notes generated by the arpeggiators rather than the notes used to trigger the arpeggiator, we need to set every part to external, and then it works just like the ARP MIDI out setting on the classic MONTAGE. Now that we've seen the basics of getting a project set up, we can take these principles and build a project template so that next time we start a project, we don't have to start from scratch. I want my template to cover all 16 parts and 16 stereo audio tracks, so I'm going to delete all my tracks and start again so I can get pretty colours in Logic. As soon as all tracks are deleted, Logic will open the new track dialog because a project can't be open without at least one track. This time around, I'm going to choose an external MIDI track without the external instrument plugin and set its destination to Montage M, port 1 and channel 1. Make sure the ascending option is enabled and create 16 tracks. These will automatically increment the channel destination number by 1 for each track, so we'll have tracks for all 16 available MIDI channels, and you'll see that Logic has automatically named the MIDI tracks according to their destination. Right now, while each of those MIDI tracks will output to a specific MIDI port and channel, they will receive MIDI from all sources when they're record armed, so we must rather laboriously go through each track in turn and instruct them to only listen to the channel they have set as their destination. At the same time, I'm going to rename each track as MIDI and the channel number, and you'll see why later. I'll time-lapse through this process because it's very tedious and takes a very long time. I'll quickly change all my icons for the tracks just because. Then I'll add all the tracks to a track stack. It's going to be a folder stack, and I'm going to name it Montage M MIDI. Next, we need to add 16 audio tracks just as we did before. We'll start off with the audio mic or line type, choose input 1-2, main LR, and create 16 ascending tracks. Then I'll select all the audio tracks and add them to another track stack, which I'll set as a summing stack, which I'll rename as Montage M Audio. This project is now ready to be saved as a template, so I'm going to go to File, Save as Template, and save this as Montage M 16 parts. Most of the time I don't use all 16 parts, so I'm also going to save a version with just 8 parts. I'll delete the final 8 audio tracks and the final 8 MIDI tracks, and use Save as Template again, saving this time as Montage M 8 parts. Now when we start a new project in Logic, we can start with one of our templates and shortcut through all that initial setup. If you previously watched my Logic Pro integration with Montage and MODX video, you might be surprised that this time around I didn't add a final track to host Montage Connect, which is a brilliant utility that allows the hardware to load the performance saved with the project. But Montage Connect doesn't work with Montage M, and there are no signs that Yamaha will release an updated version. However, all is not lost because we can still tell Montage M to load a specific performance with a Logic project, we just have to do it in a slightly more cumbersome way. When you have a performance loaded on your Montage M, whether it's a preset performance, part of a library, or one of your own user performances, you can press Shift and Performance Home and you'll get a rundown of the properties of the current performance, including its complete address within the system. The important data here is the bank select information and the program change number, because we can feed this to Logic in order to have it load a particular performance. The current performance, 2310 Hybrid AUK, shows MSB, that's most significant byte 65, LSB, least significant byte 26, and program change 64. A little caveat here is that normally program change numbers start from 0 and run up to 127, but Yamaha uses numbers 1 to 128, so we need to subtract 1 from the program change number when working with non-Yamaha systems like Logic Pro. To send the program change instruction, we have to pass it using MIDI on the global MIDI channel in use by the Montage M, which in our case now is channel 1. I'm going to create a new MIDI region on the track pointing to channel 1, and then use the event list to manually input those program change instructions. Initially, we need to create 2 controller events and a program change event. Normally you'd do this at the very beginning of the timeline, but I'm going to do it when we reach the bar 1 point. We'll set the first controller event to number 0, which corresponds to most significant byte, and set its value to 65. The second controller event needs to be controller number 32, which is least significant byte, and that will get a value of 26. Finally, the program change needs to be what the montage showed us, -1 to compensate for the difference between 0-based and 1-based counting, so 63. Now, if we select a different performance with the Montage M, and then let the MIDI play back, we'll get the correct performance back on the Montage M. One advantage of this approach over Montage Connect is that your MIDI can instruct the Montage M to change performance at any point during a Logic project, so you could actually make use of multiple performances within a single project. Let's have the Montage M change to the Composer Felt Piano performance 1 bar after the previous change. Composer Felt Piano has MSB 65, LSB 0 and program change number 27, so we need to insert those values into our MIDI region, remembering to decrement the program change number, so MSB 65, LSB 0 and program change number 26. And as we play back the MIDI region, we can see the Montage M automatically and instantly switch the performance according to the instructions we set. So far, we've been using the Montage M both as a MIDI controller and a tone generator, but there's no reason you can't use Montage M as a MIDI controller for virtual instruments. When working like this, there's no real reason to disable local control, so I'm going to use Quick Setup standalone to bring the Montage M back to its regular playing mode. With the current configuration, I'm going to hear my virtual instrument layered with the Montage M sounds, and for the purposes of this demo, I want to hear it alone, so I'll just take the current part and set it to external. Let's head down to the bottom of our list of tracks and create a new software instrument track. This next step is applicable only when using the Montage M itself as your audio interface, but I'm going to set the audio output for the virtual instrument to output 3/4 or digital LR on the Montage M, because that will allow me to isolate the virtual instrument output from the output of the Montage M tone generator itself. As soon as I select a virtual instrument, I can play it with the Montage M and make use of all the expressive capabilities of the Montage M keybed, including channel aftertouch for Montage M6 and M7 or polyphonic aftertouch with the Montage M8X. I can also control the volume of the virtual instrument directly on the Montage M by changing the mode of the faders from parts 1 to 8 to USB audio, and then the first fader will control the volume of everything coming in on the digital LR audio port. Additionally, I can apply Montage M effects directly to the digital LR input, so if you want to add shimmer reverb to an Arturia CS80, knock yourself out. Earlier, we briefly touched on the subject of internal and external parts. When playing with the built-in keyboard, you don't actually need to set a part to be external in order to play a virtual instrument, or even a connected hardware synth. There are 3 reasons why you might want to set a part to be external. The first of these would be to allow the Montage M to send program change messages to your connected instrument, like we did with Logic telling the Montage M to load a particular performance just now. The second would be if you want to use the Montage M arpeggiator to play another instrument, as external mode is the only way to have arpeggiated notes output over MIDI right now. The third would be if you want to be able to send data on several MIDI channels from parts with keyboard control enabled. But if all you want to do is have the Montage M keyboard play a virtual or hardware synth that already has the correct sound loaded, an internal part will do the job just fine, and even allows you to layer a Montage M sound with a sound from another source, which an external part currently will not, although this is a change from the behaviour of the classic Montage, and there is a Yamaha Synth Idea Scale suggestion to allow external parts to continue to play the internal tone generator, which could use your vote. On the classic Montage, the DAW Remote function was added relatively late in the development process, so you can only access it via a control on the display, but thankfully Montage M has a dedicated button on the control panel. Before we can use it, we have to configure it for Logic, so let's press the DAW Remote button and click on Settings. From here, select Logic and MIDI channel 1. Next, we need to configure Logic, so go to the Logic Pro menu and select Control Surfaces and Setup. From here, click on New and then Install. Use the filter box to search for Mackie and then select Mackie Designs, Mackie Control. Don't click the scan options as they will just sit there fruitlessly searching for something they'll never find. Just hit Add. If you already have a Mackie control device set up, like a classic Montage, Logic will show you a warning, but you can ignore it. Next, we're going to select the newly added Mackie control device and rename it as MONTAGE M. When the DAW Remote is active, it will show a coloured bar against tracks it currently controls, so let's use the colour picker to choose something that we can easily identify. Finally, we're going to set both the output port and input port to MONTAGE M port 2. That's port 2, which is reserved for the DAW Remote, not port 1, which is the standard MIDI transmission channel that we've used for everything so far. As soon as you set the input port, you'll see coloured bars appear next to the first 8 tracks of your project, indicating that these are currently controlled by the MONTAGE M DAW Remote. Extraordinarily concatenated versions of the track names appear in the DAW Remote display, and now you see why I gave my MIDI tracks very short names like MIDI 1, MIDI 2, etc. There are 3 modes in which the DAW Remote operates, those being transport mode, where the MONTAGE M controls playback and recording, track mode that allows you to adjust volume and panning of DAW tracks, and plug-in mode, where the knobs and faders on the MONTAGE M can control virtual instruments. Regardless of the DAW Remote mode, the transport controls will work to start and stop playback and recording, and you can use the forward and backward buttons to skip around the project, with multiple clicks on one button increasing the speed and a click on the opposite button cancelling the movement. The song pattern button serves to toggle loop playback. You also have the option to enable the data dial and the cursor buttons for moving the playhead around. We can use the track controls in the bottom right of the display to shift that coloured bar up and down by 8 tracks at a time, changing the currently controlled set of tracks. You can also use the bank buttons to the right of the button grid to do the same job, or the page buttons will shift the track selection by just 1 track at a time. The most straightforward mode in which the DAW Remote can operate is transport mode. In this mode, all of the physical controls on the MONTAGE M continue to function as though you were in a regular performance, but the transport controls are directed to the DAW rather than the onboard sequencer. In both track and plug-in mode, the MONTAGE M control panel controls various elements of the DAW. You can use the part select buttons on the MONTAGE M to select any one of the 8 tracks currently controlled by the DAW Remote, and normally the selected track will be armed to record. If you want to manually select the tracks to be record armed, you can switch the part buttons to keyboard control mode, and then you can select any tracks you like to be record armed. A second click will disarm recording. Clicking several buttons at the same time will toggle the record arm status of multiple tracks, allowing you to have more than 1 track record armed. You can also use the shift buttons together with the part select and keyboard control modes to switch the part buttons to toggle mute and solo for tracks, as you would when playing the MONTAGE M itself. Having to switch the part buttons to different modes to toggle record arm, mute and solo isn't quite as elegant as the multi-purpose button grid on the classic Montage, but what's done is done, and this is what we have to work with. In track mode, the 8 assignable knobs control the pan of the 8 selected tracks, and the 8 faders control their volume. As you move the controls, the track name is temporarily replaced by the function currently operating, and you can see the value being input on the box above. The final mode is plug-in mode, and it warrants a closer look. Plug-in mode changes the knobs and faders to send MIDI control messages to virtual instruments. It's entirely up to you how to assign MIDI CCs to each knob and slider, but I like to set mine up to replicate the layout of an Arturia controller so that I can control Analog Lab and instruments from the V collection without any further configuration. This is the MIDI control center for Arturia hardware, and if we inspect the various controls, we can see the control numbers assigned to each. I'll put a table showing the assignments on screen while we set up the MONTAGE M. In plug-in mode, we hit the Edit control, then click on each knob and slider in turn and enter the correct MIDI CC number, remembering that if you've set the data dial to control the playhead, it won't work as expected to actually enter data on the MONTAGE M until you turn it off. To see plug-in mode in action, we need to load a project with some virtual instruments. As I configured the MONTAGE M with MIDI CC controls modelled after an Arturia Keylab Essential Mark III, I'll select a track containing an instance of Analog Lab. I'll open up the instrument interface and configure it to expect the Arturia hardware whose MIDI CCs I input into the MONTAGE M. Now, when I move the knobs and faders on the MONTAGE M, the plugin on the record-armed track will respond as though it has that Arturia keyboard connected, and you can see the various parameters change as I move the controls. I'm going to show you something that's caught me out a few times. Let's open the plugin for this other track and mess around with the controls on the MONTAGE M. As you can see, nothing is happening. The simple explanation for this is that the DAW Remote controls always work on the selected track, so even if you have the interface for a plugin open, unless its host track is selected, the DAW Remote controls will be working elsewhere on the track that is currently selected. There's no way to switch between different preset MIDI CC layouts for your MONTAGE M DAW Remote, so I'd recommend using a layout that covers a large number of virtual instruments without any further configuration. Thankfully, most virtual instruments will offer some sort of MIDI learn functionality, so you can apply your own custom MIDI layouts to their controls. Here, I'm using MIDI learn to set the Arturia configuration to Native Instruments Complete Control. And once that's done, I can operate complete control from the MONTAGE M using the Arturia MIDI CC numbers. In fact, any virtual instrument that supports MIDI learn can be set up to use this layout or any other you may have set up. Apart from acting as a host for virtual instruments and recording audio and MIDI, another important function for a digital audio workstation such as Logic is MIDI routing. We've already seen how to record and playback MIDI from the MONTAGE M, but we can also use Logic to have MONTAGE M control other instruments and vice versa. Let's look at a few examples. Controlling other MIDI instruments with MONTAGE M through Logic is really easy. Just create a new MIDI track, set the MIDI destination to your instrument of choice, in this case the Phantom, selecting the appropriate MIDI channel on which that instrument is listening, and start playing it with the MONTAGE M. If you want to tighten the control slightly, so that only the MONTAGE M controls that instrument, you can specify MONTAGE M port 1 as the MIDI input, allowing other connected instruments to play without affecting the Phantom. One really powerful feature you can use is having the MONTAGE M arpeggiator control an external instrument, providing any other instrument access to the best arpeggiator in the business, even if they don't have one of their own. To do this, you must set the MONTAGE M part that will be controlling the external synth to external, otherwise the other synth will only receive the notes you actually play rather than the notes generated by the arpeggiator. Working in the opposite direction, having another instrument control the MONTAGE M is just as simple. This time we'll create a new MIDI track with MONTAGE M port 1 as the destination. I'll set the channel to point to a particular part of the MONTAGE M performance, and off we go. Let's set the quantum to control that track, then add another pointing to another part, and set my classic montage to control that track. Now I can play both of those parts at the same time with two separate keyboards, and two separate players if I had them available to play. If you're a MONTAGE M6 or M7 user, the FSX keyboard of your instrument can't play polyphonic aftertouch, which is used by a large number of the new MONTAGE M ANX performances. But by connecting a keyboard capable of playing poly aftertouch, you can route the MIDI to the MONTAGE M and unlock all of those performances. I have a video specifically dedicated to this subject, which I've linked in the description. Everything we've done so far has used the MONTAGE M itself as our audio interface. And if your project is going to use nothing but the MONTAGE M, that's completely fine, because the MONTAGE M has an extremely high quality audio interface, and you could do a lot worse than to connect your studio monitors directly to the main outputs of the MONTAGE M and be done with it. I said earlier that I'd deal with how to work with audio interfaces other than MONTAGE M itself, and if you're anything like me, you'll have multiple devices in your studio, some of which may also provide their own USB audio channels that you may want to use in your projects. For my part, I have the MONTAGE M, a classic Montage, and a Roland Phantom, all of which provide their own USB audio channels. Plus, I have my microphones, analog synths, and speakers all connected to a separate audio interface. If you look at Logic's audio preferences, it appears that you can select any one of these devices to be your input and output, but not several at the same time. So on the face of it, there's no way to have a project with the microphone and analog synths connected to my audio interface, while also having USB audio from my MONTAGE M and Phantom. Selecting any one of these gets rid of the inputs from the others. Now, you could do all your work with one device, with that device selected as the audio interface in use by Logic, then bounce all the tracks to audio before switching the audio to another device and doing whatever needs to be done with that device, but that's very long-winded and tedious. Thankfully, macOS provides a solution, and it's called an aggregate audio device. Let's head back to Audio MIDI Setup, and in Audio Devices you'll see a plus gadget in the toolbar. Click that and select the option to create a new aggregate device. What this is going to do is allow us to create a virtual device that combines any other audio interfaces we want into a single unified device. Normally, the first device you should select is the device to which your main speakers or monitors are connected. In my case, that's the Motu Ultralight Mark V. As soon as you add an interface to your aggregate device, Logic will detect a new audio device and ask if you want to use it. For now, let's ignore it and continue. Back in Audio MIDI Setup, you'll see the first device listed as a sub-device within the new aggregate device, along with all of its inputs and output channels. My Ultralight has an ADAT expansion connected, so it shows 20 input channels and 22 output. Next, I'm going to select the MONTAGE M device, which will add another 32 input channels and 6 output channels. For demonstration purposes, I'm also going to add the classic Montage device. So now I have a virtual device with 84 inputs and 34 outputs. I'll rename the device to something meaningful and head back to Logic. Here, I'll open Settings, Audio Devices and set both the input and output to use my aggregate device. Now, when I create a new audio track, I can choose to record any of the inputs from any of the sub-devices within the aggregate device. With an audio interface, a classic Montage and a MONTAGE M all aggregated, there's a fearsome list of inputs, and it's not immediately apparent which USB channels belong to the MONTAGE M and which to the classic Montage, as their inputs are very similarly named. Thankfully, there's a way to label these inputs in a more useful way. So let's open Mix I/O Labels, and here you have the ability to provide your own labels for inputs. I like to add part numbers to my inputs along with the device name. Do bear in mind that these I/O labels are set at the global level within Logic and apply based on the input number on the selected audio device within Logic. So if you provide labels that match your aggregate device, but occasionally you use other devices, the channel labels you see in Logic will be nonsense. I don't know why Apple decided that these labels should not be tied to the audio interface in use, but for whatever reason, they're not. So we need to create new versions of our project templates to work with the aggregate device. I'll create a new project based on my MONTAGE M 16 parts template. Then delete the entire audio track stack, and then create 16 new audio tracks with the input set to the first MONTAGE M audio channels ascending to the final MONTAGE M channels. Put that back into a track stack and save that as MONTAGE M 16 parts aggregate audio. I'll do the same to create a version of the 8-part template. One final word about aggregate devices. If any of the devices within your aggregate device fail to connect or incorrectly identify themselves after a reboot or a sleep event, you may find that your aggregate device breaks. The classic Montage is a particular offender here, as it doesn't appear to provide a unique identifier to macOS, so you may find that when it reconnects, or if you connect to a different USB port on your computer, it shows up as Montage, but not necessarily the same Montage as the one with which you created your aggregate device. At least there is a simple repair process for this problem. In Audio MIDI Setup, look for missing subdevices within your aggregate device and remove them. You also need to remove any other devices that are listed after the missing device. Next, just reselect the devices in the same order as you originally selected them, and your aggregate device will be repaired. Now that we've seen how to route MIDI to different instruments, and we have the ability to use multiple audio devices at the same time, I'm going to show you how to use Logic to add both hardware and virtual instruments to your MONTAGE M performances. Everything I do here is a combination of the principles we've already covered, but this should serve as a helpful roundup. Let's build a new performance. I'm going to start with a multi-part piano on the MONTAGE M, and this will transmit on the global MIDI channel because all the parts have keyboard control. Next, I'm going to add 3 parts that will each play separate sounds from external sources. So I'll add internal sounds for those parts, but then set them all to external. I'm doing this so that I can assign an outgoing MIDI channel to each instrument. I'll set the first external sound to use MIDI channel 2, the second to use MIDI channel 3, and the third to use MIDI channel 4. I'm also going to add an arpeggio to the part using MIDI channel 4. And finally, I'll set some keyboard range limits so that some of the external parts don't play across the entire keyboard. Now, in Logic, I'm going to create 3 tracks to route the outgoing signals from the MONTAGE M to the appropriate destinations. The first of these is going to play the Quantum. The Quantum doesn't have a USB audio interface, and its sound output goes into one of the inputs on my main audio interface, so I'm going to use the external instrument plugin to capture audio as well as MIDI. I'll get that track set up to listen to MONTAGE M port 1 channel 2. Next, I want a sound from Pigments, so I'll create a software instrument track, load the sound I want, and have it listen to MONTAGE M port 1 channel 3. Finally, I'm going to have a sound from my trusty PSS 680, which is hooked into an ADAT expansion on my main audio interface, so we'll be using the external instrument plugin again. This vintage synth also doesn't have USB MIDI, so I actually have it connected to the MIDI out port of the MONTAGE M. While the MONTAGE M is in USB MIDI mode, it can't address its DIN-MIDI ports directly, but it does expose its DIN-MIDI connections as MONTAGE M port 3, so you could create a MIDI track with a destination of MONTAGE M port 3. Or, if this is an instrument you have permanently connected, you can go to the MIDI Studio in Audio MIDI Setup and create a new device with an appropriate name. Then, drag a cable from the port 3 output on the MONTAGE M device to your new instrument, and now that instrument will appear directly as a MIDI destination in Logic. So I just need to tell the external instrument plugin that its destination is the DIN-MIDI connected PSS 680 device. Then I'll set the input port to MONTAGE M port 1 channel 4 and we're good to go. Now I can record arm all those and play my multi-part, multi-instrument performance. At this point, you might be wondering why I bothered to use external mode for the parts that play the external instruments, because I could have had them all listen to the global MIDI channel being output by the MONTAGE M, and they would have played all together just fine. But giving them their own discrete MIDI channels means that I can use the keyboard control switches on the MONTAGE M to switch those parts on and off directly, either with the keyboard control buttons or using scenes if I wanted to set that up. Let's go into the scene menu and set up a few scenes, all of which will manage keyboard control. I'll have a scene where just my piano plays, another where I introduce the sound from the Quantum, another where I bring in Pigments, one where I just play the PSS 680, and a final scene with everything playing all together. However, the use of external parts does some weird things to MONTAGE M that did not happen with the classic Montage or MODX. The most obnoxious of these is the loss of MIDI transmission for any internal parts. In fact, if your performance has any part set to external, then no internal parts will output MIDI of any kind, and you may have noticed that while MIDI was recorded for channels 2, 3 and 4 when I played just then, nothing at all was recorded for channel 1 where the internal parts were located. Staggeringly, this is actually the designed behaviour for MONTAGE M, and it's actually documented in the operations manual. I've got another video coming up to discuss why I believe this is a flawed design, but for now just be aware of it when recording MIDI from performances that have a mix of internal and external parts. Of course, a video describing how to integrate MONTAGE M with a DAW would not be complete without talking about the virtual MONTAGE M, the expanded soft synth plugin or E.S.P. Let's go for the basics first. Setting up a basic track running E.S.P is no different from any other virtual instrument. You start with a software instrument track, then click on the instrument slot and choose AU Instruments, Yamaha Corporation, Expanded Soft Synth plugin for M and Stereo. Then, if it didn't open already, you can click again on the now green instrument button to load the E.S.P interface. You should regularly keep E.S.P updated with your user content on your MONTAGE M by using the sync system, and if you've never synced before at all, you should use the full backup sync to get the entire contents of your MONTAGE M into E.S.P before you get started. When you're ready, you can load a performance and edit it however you like. You can play E.S.P with any connected keyboard, not just the MONTAGE M. In fact, you don't even need to have the MONTAGE M connected at all, because E.S.P is an entirely independent system. If you want to follow along with this part of the video, I've created a performance and uploaded it to SoundMondo, which you'll need to sync to your MONTAGE M and then from the MONTAGE M to E.S.P. There's a link to the performance in the description. In this performance, I have a 2-part piano, a 3-part pad, a bass and a lead. Keyboard control in E.S.P works in a similar way to the hardware MONTAGE M, in that any parts with keyboard control enabled will respond to incoming MIDI data on the track hosting the plugin. But how about playing parts that don't have keyboard control? One way to do it would be to create multiple tracks, all with their own copy of E.S.P with the same performance, but edit the keyboard control settings for each one so that different tracks control different parts. But that would be a huge waste of resources and I wouldn't recommend it. Far better is to treat a single instance of E.S.P as a multi-timbral virtual instrument, and I'll show you how to do that now. The performance we're using has 4 sound groups that I want to be able to play independently, so we're going to need 4 tracks in Logic, but instead of creating 4 separate instances of E.S.P, we're going to check the multi-timbral option and say we have 4 parts. You'll see that a track is created for each part with MIDI channel numbers incrementing from 1. Initially, it looks like Logic has done nothing differently from what would have happened if we created 4 separate tracks, but the clever stuff happens when we load the plugin. If I select a performance here so that we know that we're working with a particular instance of E.S.P, and then close down the interface and open the plugin on another of the multi-timbral tracks, we'll see that the plugin is already loaded using our selected performance. You can also see that changing the volume of any of the multi-timbral tracks also changes the others. This tells us that even though we have, in this case, 4 tracks, they're all pointing to a single instance of the plugin rather than all loading their own version independently. This saves processing resources and also means that you have a central place to edit your performance without having to replicate your edits across multiple instances. Let's load in our multi-part performance and configure it so that we can play it with our multi-timbral tracks. First, I'm going to turn off keyboard control for all parts because I want full manual control over how these parts play. Next, ensuring that Common is selected rather than any single part, I'll open the menu from the bottom panel and choose Common, Control, Receive Switch. As you can see, there are a grid of switches to allow you to control what MIDI messages receive each part, but right now all we're interested in is the MIDI channel number. I'm going to assign both of the piano parts to channel 1. The 3 pad parts will use channel 2, the bass part can have channel 3, and the lead will be on channel 4. With these assignments, I can play any one of those sounds by selecting the appropriate track, or play and record combinations of sounds by record arming several of them at the same time. So I hope that this video has given you some insight into how MONTAGE M and E.S.P can integrate with Logic and with DAW software in general. If there are any related topics you'd like me to cover in a future video, or if you have any questions, please do let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.